Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a nice 6-game college basketball slate that starts at 7 o'clock. I'm sorry getting out the video late. DraftKings didn't put the thing out until later this morning, which is kind of annoying. I wish they would do it the night before so I could actually have more time to do research on the specific games they're going to do. With that said, though, we do have a pretty good little slate here. 6 games is pretty good, and we've been really doing well in college basketball. If you're a YouTube member, you already know that I've been dropping my top picks of this over there, and we've been doing very well with that. So let's keep that going today with this here. So I'm going to go through and break down each game kind of and just tell you what I think and then my top plays for each game itself. So we're going to look at this Baylor-Oregon State game first. Now this game has a pretty good spread of 100 or pretty good total of 142, which is actually fourth on the best on the slate. There are 2 sub 140 games, and then there's 3 over 150, so it's one of the mid-level ones. Baylor should win this game relatively easily. They are a 16-point favorite. However, if we're looking at fantasy perspective, we really have 2 options on Oregon State that we like, one of them being Jordan Pope. There now, he does face a tough matchup here, and he's got a little bit of risk as he's had a couple rough games to start the season. But he's played very well in the tighter games, and so I do think he has some potential here. That's like the first game he only played 27 minutes because they blew out their opponent, but the other 3 games have been closer, and he's been pretty good in those, and so I think he's got some potential on this one. He does tend to be a little scoring dependent though, so to keep that in mind, but he's capable of a solid game here, and he does hit some threes, which is definitely a boost. I'm also going to look at Abilido. Sorry if I'm butchering your name anyway. He's played very well so far this season. His price point is very good for what he's done. In the 3 games outside the blowout at the start of the season, he's been right at 30 fantasy points in each one or more, and that is very good for his price point today, so I really do like him as a great option on the slate. Moving on to the Cincinnati-Georgia Tech game. Now, I do like several players from this game. This game has a higher total score at 150, which is 3rd best on the slate. It's definitely a slate that's really worth taking a group of games worth taking a look at. However, Georgia Tech is favored to lose the game by 10 points, and they do have better options. So I'm going to point out that all the players that I mentioned and from this game are going to be high-risk plays. We'll start with Cincinnati since there's just a 1, and it's going to be Skillings off the bench. Now, his minutes are potentially going to be affected with Bandogo being back, and he hasn't played yet this season. I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but just based off on how he's played so far, playing around 25 minutes a game, he's been very solid for this price point, and he's hard to ignore from that perspective. He also had a big game in his last game, though this game will be, in Cincinnati's favor as well. He's played pretty good amount of minutes. He's getting a lot of shots. He's also rebounding the ball well for a guard, so I do like his potential here. So he's definitely a potential option. However, just keep in mind Bendango for Cincinnati is likely to be back today. He has yet to play, but he got cleared by NCAA. So then we're going to look at Georgia Tech here, and we have several players I actually like quite a bit from this team, but they are at risk as they are the underdogs in a up-tempo game here. Miles Kelly is one. He's had 2 really solid games and a 3rd kind of average game. That 3rd game was a little bit strange, but I think that the first 2 games are much more likely how he's going to play in this one, and so he's going to have some nice upside, but the price is definitely a little bit high for the risk here, but he's still capable. Same goes for Reeves. He's been really good in his first 2 games, and he had a 3rd game which kind of wasn't very good. He didn't shoot the ball well. But he's very capable of having solid games, so he does need to score at least 10 to 15 fantasy points to pay off here. So do keep that in mind. And then we're also going to look at Claude for them, who's a little bit pricey as well. But again, similar situation. The first 2 games, these 3 guys played very well. The 3rd game, a couple other guys off the bench kind of did better. And so, that's kind of how this team rolls. I do expect this game to be pretty high scoring, so there's definitely got some potential here. But I did feel like Cincinnati's just too deep of a team as they have an 8 to 9 man rotation, and Georgia Tech even has a 6 to 7 man rotation. It seems like that they have 2 really solid guys coming off the bench, so do keep that in mind. But they do have some capable options on the slate. Looking at the Stanford Arkansas game here, we have a lot of guys that we like here, but this is going to be a questionable game because we have 2 guys that are questionable for Stanford who have played a couple games this season but haven't played all, and that's Jones and Angel. And Stanford does play a 6 to 8 man rotation depending on who's available. If those two guys are both not available, there'll definitely be a tight rotation. If those two guys are available, they're going to be more bench heavy today. So, and they are not favored to win this game, but it's a 6.5 point spread in Arkansas's favor at 154 point total, which is actually the second best on the slate by under the best one by 2 points. And I think both these teams have a pretty tight rotation, especially if Angel or Jones miss, that both teams have some utility on this particular matchup. So let's look at Stanford here. And Bynum is going to be a clear-cut option for this slate here. He's been very solid in his first 4 games this season. Most of these games have been pretty good too, so he has some nice upside. They're scoring the ball pretty well. They've had 3 games over 88 total points, and I do like his potential here. His price is still really good. I'm kind of surprised it's this cheap. When I was looking at his stats, I expected it to be higher. And so I do really like him as a good play. Even though his team is not favored to win, he's played well enough. And even regardless of if the other guys are back or not, he's been consistent throughout the season so far in the first 4 games. Looking at Michael Jones, he is a little bit of a risk today because if one of those Angel or Jones is playing, then that would definitely hurt him a little bit. But he still gets plenty of minutes. The usage just goes down when one or both of them are available. So if one of those guys are out, then he is definitely a great option. If one of those guys are not out, then I would probably avoid him on the slate. Then we'll look at Reynard here for Stanford as well. He's been very consistent throughout the season so far, being up to 30 fantasy points in all 4 games at least. And he had a big game in the first game, which was actually the closest game, at least one of the closer games they've had. So I do think he'll get plenty of minutes in this one and have a lot of opportunity. He's also rebounding the ball well, and I like his potential here, and he's nice and cheap. I also expected him to be more expensive based on the how he's played. I know this is a tougher matchup against Arkansas, but I think this is going to be a pretty high-scoring game, so he's a great option, and he's also been good regardless of the other situation for those guys. Then we'll look at Angel for Stanford. Now, he is questionable, so we don't know if he'll play today or not. But in his first 2 games, he played pretty solid, and his price point is really good. He should get plenty of minutes, and he would draw the start if he does play, and so he's definitely a viable option on the slate. And then finally, we'll look at Stokovic here. Now, he started for one of the Angel and Jones the last game, and I think he started the game before as well. He's played very well in the first and 3 of the 4 games that they played this year. He had a little bit of risk in that first game, so he does carry some risk. But if Angel and Jones are both out, then he would be somebody that I would definitely consider rostering, as he's got good upside and he'll get more minutes with those guys out. Looking at Arkansas, we have a couple guys that we like, but they are a little bit risky today. One being Mark here as a guard. Now, he's been pretty solid so far this season. He had a floor game against ODU, but I think his minutes will be closer to this 27 to 30 minute game in this one, as I don't think it's going to be a huge blowout or anything. So I think he's going to have more potential to see in the game. Obviously, if he gets into foul trouble, which he did in the ODU game, that could probably hurt his minutes some. But I expect him to have a full complement of minutes and have the potential to score over 30 fantasy points in this one again, like he did in the last game. And this is a good matchup for him, so I do like that. As for another player here, Brazil, he's also interesting, though he is also a little bit risky, much like Mark. Of course, Mark's a little bit more scoring dependent. Brazil has played well. His floor has been pretty solid so far, too. His minutes have been a little bit more inconsistent, but also due to foul situations. So do keep that in mind, but they are definitely capable, and they're the best 2 options on Arkansas for the slate. And Arkansas does play a nice tight rotation, and they have one guy that's going to probably start in Davenport, which really has no fantasy output at all, and they have a guy coming off the bench that does. So then we'll look at SMU here and Wisconsin. Now, this game is one of the lower scoring games, and it's also a 7.5 point spread for Wisconsin. Both these teams play pretty tight rotations, but they all feel pretty inconsistent here. There was a couple guys that were kind of bordering contrarian options for Wisconsin, but honestly, I'm probably going to stay away from this game because it just seems a little bit risky, as a lot of them have very low floors, and it's definitely going to be a slow down game on the slate, and there's plenty of up-tempo games and plenty of good options to use on this particular slate. Looking at the Florida UCLA game, this is a slower down game as well, but we do have a couple options here. Now, I don't love this slate, and I don't love Florida because they tend to go a little bit deeper rotation, especially with a guy coming back and pulling. But I do think both teams have some utility here, and if you need, a couple util options here, I think this is probably where these guys are going to go because I feel like all these guys are risky with the exception of one. One being Clayton for Florida. He's played very well so far this season. He had a kind of a down game against Virginia, uh, but I expect him to kind of have a pretty good game, though he does tend to be scoring dependent. He's still priced decent enough that he's viable, but he's a little bit risky at the price point that he's at. Uh, uh, so I do think he's a good play, but he's kind of risky from that perspective. Then we'll look at Samuel for Florida as well. Now he obviously has played pretty solid, and he's a little bit cheaper than Clayton, and he has almost as much upside. He's been in the high 20s or low 30s in all 4 games so far, and if this game stays pretty close, which I expect it to do, he's going to have some potential in this one, and so I do like him as a good option here. Um, if we look at Pittsburgh, we've got two guys that I like here, one being Leggett. Now, he is obviously risky with the price point in a game that's like this, but um, he definitely has some potential in this one. He's played very well so far this season, though he had one bad game at the start, but that was due to a blowout. This one won't be a blowout, and he definitely has that good potential on this one. I misspoke and said this is actually one of the higher scoring games, 156, not 139. I was looking at the wrong thing. I am apologizing for that. So moving into Federico, um, that really threw me off. Sorry about that, guys. Federico is a great option on this slate as well, though he does carry some risk as well. He's played very well and consistent so far this season. His floor is around 18 to 20 fantasy points, and in this game, which shouldn't be a blowout, he's definitely going to get more opportunity, I think. But he doesn't tend to play more than 25 to 28 minutes, which is similar to last year where he played less minutes per game. And so I do think he will play around 25 minutes in this one, especially if it stays close, which it should because it's a 5-point spread. Moving into the last game of UCLA and Gonzaga, we have a very interesting, slower game here, but it's a tight game at just 4.5-point spread. It does have a 139-point total. Both these teams do use relatively tight rotations as well, and so they do have some potential. Um, uh, as for UCLA, I do think that Dylan Andrews is probably the best option on this team, though he does carry some risk. He does have a very low floor, but his price is still pretty good, and I expect this game to relatively stay close. And UCLA has a tighter rotation, so he has some more minute potential than some of the other guys in his price range. And then Berkey Buat, I don't even know how to say your name. I'm sorry. In his first 2 games he played pretty. He didn't score in the first one, even though he took 7 shots, and he scored 23 fantasy points in the second one. I look for a similar game to the second game in this one, as he's going to play around 25 to 28 minutes, and I think he'll, especially if it's a tighter game, he should play more as long as he doesn't get into foul trouble. He's just too cheap, and he is starting now, so that gives him a lot of potential. And then if we look over at Gonzaga, we're going to look at Nolan Hickman, who seems a little bit underpriced for what he's done so far this season, though he does carry a lower floor because he's not a huge assist and rebound guy. He definitely has some potential, especially with some of the steals he's been getting. And then Nimhard for Gonzaga, he's probably my favorite play from this team, as he's been pretty consistent so far this season. If you just throw out the game in the blowout game, which this won't be, he's going to have some nice potential. He should play 35 plus minutes and have a lot of upside. And he's definitely what I would consider a core play on the slate, even though it is a tougher matchup. And then Anton Watson also has some nice potential in this one. He's played very solid in 3 of the 4 games. The Purdue game was a little bit rough, but he got into foul trouble. I don't expect him to have the same problem against UCLA, who, while they do have Bona, who's a good player, I don't expect him to have as much issue here, and I think it'll be more along the lines of the Yale game, and so I think he can score around 30 fantasy points and be a viable option on the slate at this position. So with that said, guys, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.